Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 26th of May, 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio behind the technical desk is Nick Green. Now, if some of you are wondering why I'm doing so many news editions on my own, the simple answer for that is we are doing a lot of work at the moment for some quite exciting changes at UK Column. We'll be announcing more of those in due course, but Mike Robinson busy at work on the website, amongst other things, and we'll have a few announcements in due course. So there we are, lots of hard work going on. What's the weather doing? Well, I'm pleased to say that London is pretty sunny. It's sunny and cloudy in Rhondda. Apparently Essex is the same, sun with some patches of cloud. But poor old Manchester, it's looking grey. No reports of weather north of the border. We'll wait for that on Friday, with northern exposure, of course. Well, the truth is finally out, and it gives us much pleasure to start today's news with absolute truth, and here it is. It comes from the Daily Mirror, but do we believe their headline? I'm afraid to say we do. All MPs lie. And this has come as a statement from Sir Malcolm Bruce, ex-Lib Dem deputy leader. He was defending Alastair Carmichael by saying that, well, actually lying is widespread in public life. So really this is a fairly important point, isn't it? If we look at any of the problems going on in UK at the moment, well, the policy has been developed by all three of the main political parties coming out of lies. And of course, the effects of those policies of coming out of lies as well. And we now get a better feeling for why, for example, the Conservatives would want to remove previous pre-election promises from their websites so as not to confuse us in the election that's just taken place. So our politicians lie. How were they lying during these recent elections? Well, we have it on good authority, and I'm going to say extremely good authority, that there was a pact established between Labour and the Conservatives that neither of those two parties would talk about the issue of child abuse during the electioneering period. And of course, the Lib Dems were only too happy to join in with that pact. So we have once again total smoke and mirrors, the public not told the truth. But isn't it interesting that the Conservatives and Labour, of course, were so concerned about the damage that the subject of child abuse could do that they decided simply not to talk about it or to tell the public that they'd reached this closed-door agreement. Well, that leads us in extremely nicely to the Hampstead abuse case, because people who have watched the harrowing video of these two young children talking about what they experienced, the detail in their evidence, the subjects, the fact they're talking about intimate parts of people's bodies, tattoos, warts, etc. And of course, how was this covered up? Well, the police, as was the case with Holly Gregg in Scotland, the police simply failed to investigate, and so they were happy to state that there was no crime. Now, obviously, this case has desperately unsettled both the political establishment and the wider establishment in Britain. We know that the atmosphere in the Metropolitan Police Force is poisonous at the moment, as senior officers in particular desperately try to silence other officers who want to speak out about the reality of child abuse. And we also have it on extremely good authority that police officers have been physically threatened in order to get them to back off this case. Well, of course, if the Metropolitan Police can use threats and intimidation on its own officers, there are some clear worries in government. And so what better thing to do than to bring in the BBC? So thank you very much to the lady who pointed out this, that Radio 4 is going to be running a series, Ritual Sexual Abuse, The Anatomy of a Panic. And this is the BBC setting out, with the help of David Aaronovitch, to simply label all reports of satanic abuse as pure conspiracy theory. This man's well qualified. He's written a book called Voodoo Histories, The Role of Conspiracy Theory in Shaping Modern History. So what have we got? Just a BBC journalist, but he is given access to 3.65 billion of propaganda machine in order to say, well, this stuff simply doesn't happen. And let's remember, of course, this is the same BBC that hosted Jimmy Savile, where it is also reported by victims that at least some of the abuse that he carried out was done in a ritualistic fashion. Well, Mr. Aaronovitch is going to be assisted by this lady, Rosie Waterhouse, and several other journalists and so-called specialists. If you go to City University, you can have a look at her background, freelance journalist with extensive experience as an investigative reporter, and she's worked with national papers and BBC Newsnight, but she's most recently written a series of articles in Private Eye on the satanic panic. So we're not quite sure what this lady's real qualifications are, but she's part of the BBC team to absolutely close down any testimony from abused children that they were abused within a satanic ritualistic environment. If anybody would like to challenge Rosie on this, we understand that she's going to be giving a talk at Woolwich Road, Greenwich. It's a pub. This is the advert here, the Star and Garter, and it is, where are we? Let's just highlight it, Wednesday, June the 3rd at 7:30 p.m. So if possibly there are people in the London area who are deeply concerned with, of course, the state's cover-up of child abuse, maybe you should pop along to place a few pertinent questions in front of this lady. Well, it's not only the BBC that simply refuses to investigate child abuse or the real causes of it. Let's take ourselves back to a statement by this lady Barrister Barbara Hewson. She was saying a little over a year ago that Jimmy Savile's satanic abuse was unlikely as alien abduction. So this is just her guess. It's just a supposition. She's does not appear to have done the investigation herself. But contrast this barrister's opinion with this report in the Daily Mail about a satanic cult at work in Wales. This was the gentleman featured, Colin Batley. He was found guilty at that time of 35 sex offences against children and young adults. Social services had been alerted in 2002. They, of course, took no action. And at the Semi-Detached in Kidwelly, South Wales, he would dress in hooded robes, chant before an altar, and then orchestrate or participate in group sex with his female followers. Now, I have been present at a presentation in Westminster when the police who investigated this particularly unpleasant case reported to an audience as to how difficult it was to bring it to light. However, they did achieve it. Why did it need to be brought to light? Well, let's have a look at this line here from the article. One helpless girl was initiated when she was just 11 and threatened with death by cult assassins if she did not comply. At least 2 of his young victims gave birth as a result of the systematic and prolonged abuse. So the reality presented in Westminster by courageous policemen and women were that they had taken a great deal of time and effort to investigate and close down this abusive cult. But we are being told by the BBC and indeed barristers that this is complete nonsense. Well, why is the state so desperate to cover up? UK Column has always maintained that that is simply because paedophilia gives the state and the establishment the means to blackmail people to do their bidding. And if we are going to get involved in, if the state is going to get involved in blackmail, who better to have on your side than GCHQ, of course, with fantastic information on virtually all of us. And it's taken the Express here to run this headline: paedophile Mason ran lodge that was originally set up for GCHQ. And they're talking here about this gentleman, Keith Harding, a former membership secretary of the Paedophile Information Exchange, and he was made the worshipful master of the Mercurius Lodge in Cheltenham, Gloucestershire in 2011, and they boast accurately that the lodge was set up with the help of GCHQ. He died, the man died last summer, but of course he presided over Masonic ceremonies and rituals. We understand from people who seem to be very well informed that this was known within GCHQ. So we're going to say we've got another occasion here that we've got assets of the British state fully aware of child abuse and the activities of paedophiles, but this is kept away from the general public. But the secret, of course, is maintained behind closed doors so that people can be controlled, blackmailed and used. There we are. So we started off with somebody quite happy to say that basically MPs lie. Well, we all knew it, but it's good to see it in the national press. And we can couple that with the fact the state is certainly prepared to lie in order to cover up the sheer scale of child abuse in Britain, and the fact that we have senior members of the establishment, MPs, judges, police, military officers and others who are involved in the abuse of children. Well, having praised the police in South Wales, let's just have a look at this organisation. We've started to talk about it. It's the replacement for ACPO. It's NPCC, National Police Chiefs Council. We've asked them recently if they could explain what has happened to the considerable assets of ACPO. And the only response we can get from NPCC at the moment is that the close down of the ACPO company is being done in accordance with the guidelines of Companies House. They seem to have sidestepped the simple answer, what happened to the assets? But the reason we're flagging NPCC up now is because of this unit, which features on their website. It's the National Domestic Extremism and Disorder Intelligence Unit. This has been set up in order to basically gather intelligence on anybody who's considered to be an extremist. And we know how wide that definition has become. But we are particularly interested in this unit because the UK column has been told in the last few days that agencies such as NDE-UIU have been given unlimited overtime, and they've had their leave stopped for the month of July 2015. Now, we haven't got further details. We believe that this information is accurate, and we think it suggests that the British state at the moment is worried about the effect of major demonstrations on austerity, which are planned for the summer months. We, of course, would warn that any demonstrations are likely to be infiltrated by people working for the state who have got agitation in their mind. So do think carefully about getting involved in demonstrations, and also watch out for those who would stir up violence, because this is just what David Cameron needs for further state clampdowns. While Britain is becoming ever more of a police state, of course, Mr. Cameron in particular would have us focus on President Putin. And we were very interested to see that apparently the international community is now in arms against President Putin because he's taken the bold step of deciding he's going to close down and throw out organisations which he believes are hostile to the safety of Russia. So this headline here from the Mail: Putin sparks international outcry by signing new law banning undesirable non-governmental organisations from Russia. We thought we would just remind the British public of who he's dealt with before. University World News here is talking about a clash between the British Council and Russia. So their offices outside of Moscow all closed down because Russia came to the conclusion that the British Council was up to no good. If you haven't visited their website, do have a look, because according to the British Council, they're creating international opportunities for the people of the UK and other countries, and they're out there building trust between them worldwide. And apparently they call that cultural relations. So you can dig deeper into the background of trouble between the British Council and Russia with this Guardian article. For example, the British Council's regional offices in St. Petersburg and Yekaterinburg are now closed, and Stephen Kinnock was then in the firing line, and the Russians wanted him out. Now, of course, we should remember that Stephen Kinnock has now become a Labour MP for the very safe seat of Aberavon. And we should also remind ourselves that he's married to the Danish Prime Minister, Helle Thorning-Schmidt. So we've got a man buried in international politics, thought he was doing a good job in Russia. Mr. Putin thinks otherwise. But let's remind ourselves of where these family connections go, because here we've got Mr. Kinnock himself, father-in-law to the Danish Prime Minister. So family relations cemented here. Why are we so interested in the Kinnocks? Well, of course, it was Julia Middleton from Common Purpose who sought advice from Glynis Kinnock in dealing with uncomfortable freedom of information requests about Common Purpose. Well, the British Council is a very interesting organisation. Education to employment, culture clash or innovation driver. They're sorting out education not only in UK but worldwide. And what better person to use than Sally Dicketts, the former chief executive of or principal of Oxford and Cherwell Valley College. And remember that it's been the UK column exclusively that highlighted the abuse of youngsters, sexual abuse, physical abuse of youngsters at her college. But she's now being used by the British Council to sell the wonderful track record of British education overseas. Of course, it was a different story when this very brave Asian spoke out and made 80 reports to Thames Valley Police of abuse. He was hounded out of his job, threatened and intimidated. Well, The Guardian also reports here that Sally Dicketts has been into China to learn what the Chinese can now tell us about how we should be running schools and educating our young people. So encouraging to know that the British Council has picked up some trustworthy experts to talk to the UK public about education. And if you'd like to have a little look at Miss Dicketts' track record, you might like to go to this organisation, Activate Learning, which is all about transformation of Britain's education system. So we are shortly going to go on to an interview between Mike Robinson and John Devine and Mark Anderson on the subject of water, the new oil. Before we run that video interview, I'll just say very gently, let us think about what has come up in the press. We've got members of the establishment happily telling us that they lie. We've got the state closed down of the abuse of children. So we're now in a state that the protection of children simply does not matter. We've got a GCHQ, which has already been brought to book for breaking rules on spying on people outside of the law, has been running a Masonic lodge headed up by a paedophile. Can we get in a worse state in the UK? We don't think so. Can it be solved? Get the truth out there. And why are we interested in water? because we believe water is the new oil, to be rationed and available only to those who can afford it. We'll be back same time tomorrow, and here we are, water the new.
So this afternoon I'm joined by John Devine from Worlds Apart and by Mark Anderson from American Free Press. Hello to you both.
Hello.
John, if I come to you first, you have a background, you're interested in water, and you're interested in, I believe that the beginning of this was technology that you had for saving water with regard to fish farms. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. My background was I graduated at resource management, back then known as Ontario Lands and Forests, subsequently natural resources. And with my networking of resource management people, I was fortunate enough to get financing to enter into a venture of building a fish hatchery with a closed system. Significant savings to be made in groundwater.
So that was a closed system. In other words, water that was dirty and being taken out of that system was filtered and put back in the other end. Is that how?
Exactly. Now, we didn't have it down to 100% recycle. We had what we call makeup water, which was 10%, but we reused the 90%. We took the solids out, stripped the ammonia, and replaced the oxygen, and put all the water through UV lights to kill the bacteria, and it worked.
You're using the past tense. I take it something has happened.
Well, we got victimized by crime here. The money manager looking after my aunt's money was financing this $2.8 million project. We found out he was stealing from the estate. And then subsequently, the government come along and destroyed the little bait and tackle shop where this all started from, in a highway widening project to help Casino-Rama succeed.
Okay, so this sparked an interest in water and water management and so on. So, I mean, what is your take on the situation these days? Because obviously we're hearing about drought in California. Is that drought is going to potentially spread to other parts of the West Coast, I suppose? But what is the situation in the States at the moment with water management?
Well, at our end, we saw a story of the state of California just recently announced they're starting to pay people to take up their lawns and replace it with different landscaping, stones and rocks, et cetera, and they're paying for some of the project. And I think Mark's probably got a handle on more what's going on down there, but the state of California is in crisis as best we can understand in Canada.
Okay, but I mean, in general, what is your interest?
Okay. We're trying to get the message out about water preservation technology, and there's probably a long list of technology that should be addressed, but ours is very interesting, the fact that the average fish hatchery in North America consumes 2,000 gallons of clean groundwater a minute, and a lot of that hatcheries using the old flow-through system, that's water in, untreated water out. There's nothing to stop it from polluting the environment and reducing the drop in the aquifers. For example, I did a really rough survey of how many fish hatcheries were drawn off the Ogallala, and I came up with a number. If they were using our closed system, which we proved to be successful at coldwater fisheries, the Ogallala would have to supply 60 million gallons of clean groundwater, less than what it's doing right now to meet the demands of the fish hatchery.
Sorry, just if I can interrupt there for 1 second, because people in Britain won't know what the Ogallala is. So what is it? It's an aquifer, but it's a pretty special one, it seems.
Yeah, the Ogallala is the world's third largest aquifer. Before mankind started tapping into it, it was the size of 9 Lake Eries. That's one of the lakes in the Great Lakes. And now it's reduced to half of that size. And they're now predicting the Ogallala will be empty in 30 to 40 years. And of course, that takes you into the world of economy, because I'm saying, how low will the wells go before the bankers say no to the farmers?
Mark, you jump in here if you wish.
John put it very well. Water is now becoming the privatized commodity of the world elite. For the forces that are at work kind of engender that, they help bring that about. And it's gotten so bad that the U.S. Agriculture Secretary, Tom Vilsack, head of the USDA, has the USDA investing $6.5 million in the Ogallala Aquifer, which is under Nebraska and some 7 other states, to help farmers and ranchers conserve billions of gallons of water and improve water quality. It's kind of a low-key announcement, but when they spend that much money just for starters, that means they know it's serious on the basis of what John just got done saying. And this fits into the larger picture, of course, without going into a lot of detail. American Free Press just ran an article, Fracking Water Used for Irrigation. So not only do we have unclean water in, water out at the standard fish hatcheries, that water polluting the environment, we also have fracking water being used for irrigation connected to Chevron and California crops, it just so happens.
Sorry, Mark, can I just understand this? You're telling me that water that has been used in the fracking process is being used for irrigating farmland?
That is the brand new article in American Free Press by Ronald Ray, and that appears to be the case. There are some claims that the water is treated somewhat before it's being used to irrigate, but it shows the extent to which these protected corporations, it shows the extent that they'll go to leverage the hallowed place that corporations have been given in our world. And so preserving the Ogallala through the proper kind of fish hatchery, like John is talking about, is critical, because people have heard about fracking and how serious that is, but they don't realize how much of the fish we eat is raised in fish farms, how many fish farms there are, and how much water through the improper system that fish farms use. And John long ago had the remedy, and that was taken away from him. So water is the new oil. It's a serious issue. It's not just about Monsanto and seeds. It's not just about central banks anymore, although the banks, as John indicated, once water becomes scarce, could deny credit to farmers here and abroad altogether.
So John, is this an attack on farming? Is it an attack on humanity in that sense, in our food supply? Because, of course, it's not just the issue of fracking and farming, fish farms here, but it's also large corporations such as Nestle stealing the water from under people's feet and selling it back to them in bottles.
Well, in Ontario, they call it the Guelph Aquifer. Nestle, the big corporation, is pulling water for bottled water, and they're currently paying $3.71 per million liters. And this takes us into the conversation I've been trying to have with the banks and the governments, because the response I get from the few who do respond to me, they're always telling me that it's too expensive, for example, to retool the fish hatcheries. So to go back to that argument, I'm saying, well, to come to a conclusion about that in financing, you have to put a value on water. Then you could justify why you would want to retool the fish hatcheries. But it goes around the circle, but the last part of it nobody seems to want to address, and that's the financing of the value of our water system. Surely we're giving it away to the corporate world right now for $3.71. I mean, it's preposterous to think you're going to replace that for that type of money. And then that takes you into, again, drawing down the aquifers, and underneath all of it is basically the existence of mankind. Take, for example, beef farming. The National Geographic says it takes 1,799 gallons of water to raise 1 pound of beef. Well, I threw the question out, how many gallons of water, clean groundwater that is, does it take to raise 1 pound of farm fish in a fish hatchery? And I threw a very rough number out for just to cause a debate, and I can't get anybody to reply to it. I said, best I can figure it's 8,000 gallons to raise 1 pound of farm fish inside a fish hatchery to the size where it goes to one of two places. It goes to stocking lakes and rivers and streams to supply fish for recreational fishermen, or to the cages for food consumption. Now, here's where the kicker really gets into the farming of fish. Not only does the hatcheries require huge amounts of water, I'm getting turned around, but the process would be to take 3 pounds of bait fish to feed 1 pound to produce 1 pound of farm fish, plus 8,000 gallons per pound. Now, that takes you back to the world picture of bait fish. To feed our fish farms, the hatcheries and whatnot, the fish are generally extracted from big ocean-going vessels from the oceans. That being almost anything they can hail, they chop it all up and dry it out and then sell it to the farmers to feed their fish. And that's 3 pounds of bait fish. And of course, everybody knows the ocean's bait fish is in critical condition. Now, our little project over here started farming bait fish. And Fisherman's Cove, the little business that was destroyed, probably the only fish hatchery in North America that sold bait fish. It was hatched, reared, and held in a closed system. Very, very significant.
Okay, so I mean, this just gets better and better then. So we've got farm fishing for consumption, human consumption. We've got fish for the farmed fish themselves, bait fish for the farmed fish themselves to consume, and we have the technology to solve the problem of water supply for these farms, and yet that doesn't seem to be acceptable technology for who? Who is actually pushing back on this? Is it the government? Is it the corporations? Who's preventing this from actually ending up on the farms?
Well, you know, the 15-year journey we've been on to get people to understand the technology and whatnot, but most of the time we receive silence. And but recently there's been some push from people saying that the government themselves have been suppressing information about science. And our science is so critical, preserving clean groundwater. Other than clean air, I can't imagine any more important. But we've written to the CBC countless times, and we continue to get silence. And it's one of those things like, what gives the CBC the right to suppress information about science at large, let alone science that we've got from the University of Guelph, which remedies or really, really reduces the amount of gallonage required to raise 1 pound of fish. The silence, I guess, at this end is just totally perplexing, and we're going on 15 years now. So, but there seems to be a stir in Canada about what the media is not telling us.
Mark, what do you think is the cause of this? Is there a policy decision being made here?
Well, I think mostly it's the intransigence of the corporate world. There's an assumption that corporations, in some people's eyes, that they operate on this free market and they love competition and they love frequent change. That is not true, except a little bit in the world of electronics. Corporations are not interested in major changes. They're interested in the status quo with capital letters because they want to keep everything under lock and key and have the leverage so they can maximize profits out of the established system. And so any system that challenges the established system is crushed or ignored. The movement for more GMO crops, Monsanto pushes back. And you have now this Bilderberg-controlled world, in a sense, where the corporations who meet under Bilderberg next month in Austria will talk about these things to privatize water supplies, to privatize water treatment plants. As cities become more cash-strapped, they sell off assets to the corporations. This is just sort of how the whole thing stacks up. And now we have, if all the world's water was 1 gallon, fresh water would be just over 1 tablespoon of that gallon. And therefore, fresh water is 0.5% of all the world on Earth. 97% is seawater, and another 2% is locked up in ice caps and glaciers. And then what do municipalities do? They take what little fresh water we have left and they contaminate it with fluoride and chlorine and other chemicals. And so then we're forced, in a way, kind of coerced or cornered into drinking this bottled water that comes about in the way that John described. So that's the big picture of how we're maneuvered into this, although water is really nature's thing, a God-given thing, if you will, and mankind can only tamper with it for so long or illicitly control it for so long before we really run into trouble like John is implicating here.
John,
but pushback is the culture. The corporate culture is the main pushback.
Okay, John, earlier we mentioned fracking, of course. How much fracking is using water out of the Ogallala, or do you know that?
That's over at Mark's bailiwick. We're over in Ontario in the heart of the Great Lakes Basin. and we don't have a lot of oil in this vicinity. But I heard constant reports coming out of the Midwest of the problems with fracking, and apparently they start causing sinkholes and one thing or another. I guess what I observed from a distance is you make one serious mistake, let off one charge of dynamite that all of a sudden releases the energies of the Earth's plate, if you want to call it that. God only knows what the ramifications of that would be. And, if we spilled a bunch of oil into the Ogallala, civilization could no longer exist in that part of North America anymore.
Well, each Monday night we produce a program on behalf of an activist in this country called Ian Crane, called Fracking Nightmare, and we've been doing this now for over a year. And one of the we had a guest on that program fairly early on in the series, discussing how the aquifers in Britain are connected. And in fact, from a scientific point of view, nobody actually understands how the aquifers in Britain are connected. And of course, if you contaminate one and destroy one aquifer, there's a very good chance you're going to find that same contamination, that same damage appearing in other aquifers. But the scale or the potential scale of the damage is unknown. Is there an understanding of the geology of aquifers in North America and the implications of draining one out, whether it's actually pulling water from other aquifers nearby, or what is the situation with how freshwater usage in the States is actually understood?
If you were to look at the timeline of science that was involved in studying fracking, and say, let's give it the benefit of the doubt, maybe 2 decades, 3 decades, if that, that's so small in the timeline of the evolution of the Earth's crust. I mean, I use the example, it's the same as we just recently learned how to look into the sun. And the timeline of science is to say what we predict will happen down the road is so minuscule, it's ridiculous. But yet, the banks, who are deeply involved in revenues from the oil industry and whatnot, don't seem to think it's a problem. But my argument is the banks also have customers, that being the people drawing off the aquifers, like the farmers and whatnot. And to make money with the fracking and don't think you're going to affect the bank's customers over there is really preposterous.
Of course, fracking isn't actually, with prices of oil and gas being where they are, fracking is increasingly not possible, and from an economic point of view. So perhaps that, for the short term at least, isn't the biggest problem we face. But Mark, in California, then the drought there, the situation there is getting worse day by day. And John was saying before the program that they are encouraging people to replace lawns and so on with other forms of landscaping. Is this a problem that is consigned to California at the moment, or how are things in Texas and other states nearby?
Well, it's most acute in California. It's perhaps the worst there in the sense that so many vegetables and fruits, particularly vegetables, are grown in huge areas of California, and therefore we're automatically more vulnerable in terms of the U.S. food supply if California has a drought. And yes, it is a good remedial thing to have fewer lawns. Lawns are kind of a waste anyway when you think about them. You can find articles online about how ridiculous it is to have a lawn and be a slave to it, riding around on a riding lawnmower with a beer here and a beer there, fun though it may be. But there are expanding concerns here stemming from California, it being the most vulnerable for reasons I just stated. But nationwide, there's much more awareness. There's many more community gardens, people growing food in their front yard, literally. Even in Michigan, there are front yard gardens. There are rooftop gardens in New York City. There's a self-sufficiency movement for food. So at least that would help reduce the vulnerability of our food supplies by getting rid of this highly centralized corporate agriculture structure we have here in the States, which is increasingly becoming common overseas. And with these United States free trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TTIP deal, the EU-US deal, under these trade deals, you're going to see more private control of water, more corporate agriculture, more corporate farms getting the vast majority of the credit from the banks, thereby pushing the small farmer even further in the back of the bus, so to speak. These are the big trends. These are the mega trends. So, but the community garden movement here in the States, the self-sufficiency movement is strong in Texas. It's strong in Michigan. It's spreading throughout the country. And this at least reduces the vulnerability of the food supply while we figure out our water policy.
But on a national standpoint, what happened to the water projects that the States was famous for going back to the 50s? What is the situation with moving water from one part of the country to another? Is this not something that is even on the political spectrum anymore?
Oh, you mean like Lake Michigan water to Arizona, that sort of thing?
Yes.
You know, they talk about it, but nobody actually does anything. One of the things I've seen, though, is in Texas, they'll set up these water commissions, kind of like zoning boards, and they'll propose taking water out of the ground in one part of the huge state of Texas and building a pipeline to put the water somewhere else far away from the community that originates it. So there is talk of piping groundwater from one part of Texas to another, but building the pipelines, all the right-of-way and the land condemnation, the eminent domain, the court cases, a la mode. I mean, there'd be so many lawsuits that make your head spin. These things get hung up on lawsuits and practicality issues. So there's been a lot of pushback on the Lake Michigan thing, and very little's been done about it. I want to read up on that. I will caution that I haven't read about that lately, but as far as I know, not much has been done with long-distance transport within the U.S., let's say, of water.
So John has one solution for one particular problem. What do we need to do to get that back on track and encourage, to get people to demand that technology is used in the production of farm fish, for example?
If you were to prioritize, where I see it from is probably the most critical thing right to start with in our water management program. I'd say let's stop the leaks. Like a leak, for example, of the 60 million gallons a day going out of the Ogallala that could be stopped by installing proper technology. Now, getting back to the farming issue in California, I read a story about I believe it was called the California Delta smelt, an endangered species. Water got so low in the river that the governments decided not to release the water to the farms, but to keep it in the rivers to keep the endangered species alive. So that particular section of California lost all their crops that particular year. So it's running a lot deeper than a lot of people realize.
You're sorry, Mark, you got something?
That's a very good point. A overemphasis on environmentalism, where environmentalism is no longer a practical matter of stewardship and becomes, forgive me, this kind of far left-wing thing where animal species always take precedence over human beings. That's another blurry line that once you walk over that line, then you have exactly what John described. Well, we could help the farmers, but let's help the snail darter instead, or some rare fish, sometimes even plant life. That kind of hyper-environmentalism generally is bad news. And of course, this all ties into global warming. We won't go there. I think that's beyond the scope of today's discussion, the global warming thing. But the environmental issues can't help but come into play here.
Well, of course, you're right, but it's not just environmentalists that are pushing that, because if we were to say Bundy Ranch, and Patrick Henningsen has been covering that story extensively. In that case, it was the desert tortoise was being used as the excuse to kick farmers off their ranchers.
Correct.
Right. So, right. But getting back to the issue of leaks, because obviously in Britain here, the famous the leakiest water company in Britain is Thames Water, which covers the southeast of the country, including London. And I don't know how many gallons of water they lose, how many millions of gallons of water they lose every year. But of course, they lose lots. Now, in Britain, we've got a pretty special situation because Margaret Thatcher's government in the 80s privatised the water system in a particular way, because what she did was sold off the rights for water companies to charge huge amounts of money for water to their end user. But those companies don't seem to be required to put any particular effort into developing the infrastructure or improving the infrastructure for future generations. And so in the Thames Water area and many other parts of this country, we have huge amounts of water lost due to to water leakage. I'll ask John about this in a second, but Mark, in the States, is water still provided as a municipal service, or is it? I understand that they're starting to privatize that more and hand that over to corporations.
Yeah, the larger cities, privatization is moving forward to some extent. The smaller towns tend to still be under municipal control, although they may contract with private companies to help manage water. Sometimes they'll have municipally owned water, but privately hired employees. Then they'll do kind of a hybrid thing. It's mainly the large cities that are cash strapped. And just as some states will sell off a freeway to a corporation and turn it into a toll road, privatize its operations, cities also, in a like-minded way, if they're cash strapped, will sell off water assets, sometimes entire water treatment plants, to private control, as happened earlier in the United States history when most electrical utilities used to be publicly owned, but have now been turned over to private companies. So it's following that trend, but small towns still tend to maintain pretty much the municipal control.
And I mean, what are the terms when they do sell these off? What are the terms? What are the private companies expected to do in terms of maintenance and sort of regeneration for the future?
Well, generally speaking, I think the idea, like for example, a toll road, the Indiana toll road was leased to a private company, I believe, for 75 years, and the state of Indiana gets one chunk of money up front, but then relinquishes the operations of the toll road, and the private company that gave the state the money is allowed to charge tolls and recoup its investment and make a profit. I suspect it's along the lines of that template, but I've looked into toll roads far more than I've looked into municipal water operations, except to say that cash-strapped cities like Detroit, Michigan, are on the forefront of having a fire sale, if you will, of formerly public assets to any private entity that bails them out. That's just kind of the to and fro, the tit for tat of it.
Can you add anything to that, John?
Yes, and that takes you right back to our project of trying to get a debate going in regards to valuing of water. I mean, we're making decisions, yet nobody in the financial community, the governor of the Bank of Canada, or anybody else I've talked to, will even want to introduce into the conversation. But, it's like this, we're selling off these assets, but the commodity that we're managing and selling and giving to the private sector to do the same, we've never really put a value on it. Somebody will argue, well, it's $3.71 per million liters is what we're giving away to Nestlé in Ontario. But I asked, was that number derived through the democratic process and proper debate to the public, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Sorry, John, let me just interrupt a second. Can I just ask you about that? You said $3 and something, 71 cents per million litres, and that's what Nestle pays for the right to take those million litres. Is that what you're saying? That's
correct.
Yeah. And so they then charge $2 per litre for a bottle of water after that?
That's where the profit margin seems to be, and I'm suggesting maybe the taxpayers should be paid a lot more, or maybe we shouldn't even be drawn off the Ogallala until we're all rest assured that the Ogallala can recharge itself. You see, as best I understand, there's very different types of aquifers. Like a lot of aquifers were created by glacial ice, and the ability for them to replace the water taken out is really, really almost impossible. So if you did have an aquifer that could recharge itself and whatnot, you might want to entertain the idea of doing business with Nestle. But until that was determined, I think everybody should rein it all in. And that takes you back to the science I'm talking about in regards to what connects what aquifer to what right across the American and Canadian border, for example.
Yeah.
So it's a witch's brew.
But on the other hand, clearly Nestle have decided that they have put a value on water because they feel that they can make, but the value that they put on it is in the form of profit.
Yeah, it just seems to me that the citizens of Canada and the province of Ontario have all been kind of excluded from the pricing of the water. How do we come up with this number of $3.71 per million liters? And politicians at large seem to be just petrified to even talk about any of it. So, but of course that takes you back to the media and our control over here.
No, that's pretty spectacular. It's not something I'd considered previously. I do wonder how much fracking companies and other large corporates are being charged for their use of fresh water. That's quite an interesting thing, and maybe a bit of work that we need to do. Well, look, we're just about out of time here. Can I just ask both you and Mark for, if we start with John, ask for some final comments, and I think we'll come back to this issue in not too distant future.
Yeah, our whole emphasis here is try and tell the masses of the situation. First of all, the planet Earth is in regards to the remaining clean groundwater. But then we're saying, let's put a value on it so we can appease the banks, as they have to read everything in dollars and cents. And to get that value, we have to talk to the people. And then we can go forward. But right now, if there's any money rolling out of government coffers to the water situation, I suggest the highest priority is to stop the leaks. And as I say, my observation is the Ogallala is leaking 60 million gallons of clean groundwater a day. And nobody wants to make any effort to stop it. To stop it, it would be retooling the hatcheries, creating jobs for graduate students, and then we would have money in the bank, that being the water that's still left in the aquifer.
Okay, closing thoughts from you, Mark?
Yeah, I would add to that. Well said, John. I would add to that perhaps John and I will contact the USDA and the Secretary, Tom Vilsack, about the $6.5 million supposedly to conserve billions of gallons of Ogallala aquifer groundwater. We'll contact him about that. And what John said about the drainage on the Ogallala is exacerbated by any water used for fracking, and then the municipal contamination of water through fluoride and other chemicals. And that through these different means, water is wasted, water is contaminated, the wasted water is put back into the environment. We need to put this into a nice letter, I believe, and contact the USDA while the iron's hot. And so we'll follow through on that. As John says, stop the leaks, keep the big picture in mind, but work on the individual components of this and have a game plan, because water is the new oil, and the bankers will collateralize water like they've collateralized the whole world. And pretty soon the small farmer and economic and autarkic, as it's known, farming self-sufficiency will be rubbed out even more. And the risk is especially great under the pending Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with the EU and the US. So with these trade deals pending, the time for action is now. And so I think with that, we're in a good position to move forward for future broadcasts.
Okay, brilliant. Look, thank you. Sorry, John.
Don't forget about the XL pipeline that's going over top of the Ogallala. We haven't even talked about that yet, but we'll get it later.
Yeah, we will come back to this. John, if anybody wants to see what you're doing, how do they get in touch with you? How do they see your website or so on?
It's www.worlds-apart.ca. Worlds Apart. And we have other stories going on, but water's been the reason why we started it up, and also because the media refused to talk about it. So we've been writing now, we're going on 8 years. We've been obstructed and all that stuff, but that's for another day too.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you both very much for joining us today. We will come back to this issue in the not too distant future. And thanks again. See you soon.
Thanks, Mike.